We are artists and speakers from 14 countries, including Palestine. We gather in this festival to stand in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians and raise our voices with them to tell their story to the world. This festival is in the memory of 74 years of armed brutality against Palestinians. The festival was first conceived at the time of the brutal killing of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed in cold blood while doing her work in the Jenin refugee camp in Palestine. We lift up her memory. Since her murder in 2022, this year has become the deadliest year for Palestinians since the bombing of Gaza in 2014. This festival is to remind us that we have a social responsibility to raise our voices and take a stand with Palestinians against all forms of brutality. It is a space for us to learn about why solidarity with Palestinians is so important as a matter of human rights and social justice, and not a space for normalizing inequality. We hope to increase international solidarity and sympathy with all oppressed peoples. May it serve us to grow as a playback theater community, as artists, and as world citizens. We are grateful for the support of Sada Playback Theater for their help in the infrastructure of this festival, and all the playback theater groups and panelists that have come on board to speak truth to power. Please check out our Facebook page and Instagram for the link. And I'm going to ask that we put the link in the chat so that people can see it. You can go to those pages for all the links for all of the upcoming events. And there is an upcoming playback performance, Jews for Palestine, on Tuesday. Please check that out. I hope you will come. We'll be performing a troupe that has been formed. And please come to our last panel, which will be next Sunday, the 11th of December, which is Playback and Art as Resistance. Playback theater and the arts as a tool for social justice. And I want to say just a few words about why this panel, Forging Alternative Jewish Identities to Zionism, is important. I was recently asked how this panel was connected to playback and how did it support Palestinians? Two important points. Firstly, it is essential that the global community, and I am so happy that we really are representing the globe here, separates Judaism from Zionism. We are here today to examine and embrace alternative ways of being Jewish, whether it's secular or religious. We are finding many ways to be Jews beyond Zionism. It is our task as Jewish playbackers, and some of us here are playbackers, some of us aren't. And if you don't know about playback theater, it is a improvisational theater where we invite your stories and then enact them immediately. So it's important for us as Jewish playbackers to work with other thoughtful, creative Jews who have alternative Jewish identities to Zionism. We are here to hear from a few people who have wisdom to share about that. It does not serve our collective liberation to stay in a bubble of not examining the occupation and how it hurts everyone. Palestinians, because it is nothing short of ethnic cleansing, and Israelis as well, and all Jews, all people. How we perform playback is informed by our relationship to the world around us. I am proud of being Jewish and I reject the idea that Judaism equals Zionism or that the Israeli apartheid government speaks for me or protects me. And still, there is real anti-Semitism, and we are unequivocally opposed to that. But criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, otherwise known as IRA, would have us believe differently. They want us to not have the right to boycott. They want us to believe that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, and that is a global issue. Everything we can do, and this is the second point, everything we can do to create positive change to the Zionist tide in our community, our global community, is helpful to Palestinians. So, I want to briefly introduce our panelists. Shireen Usdin is a feminist, a medical doctor, public health specialist, and a lifelong activist for social justice. She is a member of the South African Jews for a Free Palestine, affiliated to the international BDS movement. Wendy Elisheva Somerson is a writer, artist, activist, and body-based healer who helped found the Seattle chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. They facilitate Ruach, embodied Jewish anti-Zionist healing groups held in an anti-racist and feminist framework. And I wonder if Ayela Wynters has been able to join us. I don't think so. So we will get started. And if Lori is able to join us, she will. So thank you both for being here. I want to start out with the first question, which is asking you if you would share something about your own backgrounds, your family, relationship to Judaism, to Israel, and to Zionism, and then share with us a bit about your process of coming to question Zionism. And Wendy, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Melissa. Truly an honor to be here. I'm happy to see so many faces. I grew up in the States, in the Midwest, in Ohio, in a very Christian suburb, and didn't have much Jewish community, didn't have much religious education. Both my parents did grow up Jewish. And I realized that Zionism still got passed on to me, and it got passed on in very subtle ways and not so subtle ways. I remember that when I heard about Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader at the time, that he was a terrorist. And I heard one thing that really stuck with me is that I heard that they want to push us into the sea. And so I internalized this idea that there were people in the Middle East who wanted to harm us, even though I had no idea really what that meant or what we were talking about. And then I really didn't have much Jewish community except for my immediate family. So I didn't think that much more about Zionism. I went on and lived my life. And I knew we had some vague connection to the state of Israel, but it didn't really impact me. When I was in graduate school, I was working on a degree in transnational feminist studies, and I came across the brilliant Edward Said's book on Palestine. I wish I could say that that's what woke me up. I do think it started the process, but because I didn't feel rooted or grounded in my Jewish identity, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I kept reading that Jews were oppressors, and I couldn't take it in. I felt very confused and very foggy. And it's a little embarrassing because I was studying race and gender and US identity in the global era, but I had critical thinking skills, but I couldn't take it in. And then it wasn't until probably 5 years after that that I met a bunch of queer Jewish people in Seattle. They organized me into these Shabbat dinners where we talked about Palestine and Israel. And that morphed into a study group on the history of Zionism. And in that study group, I learned about the Nakba, and I learned how Jewish terrorist forces literally pushed Palestinians into the sea, especially in Haifa. And I remember very clearly this quote from Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, about the boats in the port being very, very crowded, and as they're being pushed out, and then many of the boats sank and the passengers died. And it hit me, this is this huge reversal of what I learned. Like, we literally, Jewish people literally pushed Palestinians into the sea during the Nakba. And it really awakened me to what had happened and what I had learned and the sort of propaganda behind what I had learned. And once I had seen this, I couldn't unsee it. And our little study group on the history of Zionism became the Seattle chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace in 2005. And it's been really important for me to be an activist. Since then, I'm active with Jewish Voice for Peace. I make art that helps envision Judaism beyond Zionism, and I run anti-Zionist body-based healing groups. And it's just a huge part of my life, and I feel really compelled to help other people on this journey to really turn and face this piece of our history that we've been so misled about. So thank you. I will end there.
Thank you, Wendy. That piece about just gathering together just to celebrate Shabbos and then turn into a study group and then turn into activism is a path, is a really, really important path for us. And that we can start from those little tiny places of just like, okay, let's light a candle and ask a question. Yeah, thank you. Shireen, would you like to share on that question?
Thanks, Melissa. Well, first of all, my experience is a polar opposite to Wendy's, although I think we converge in our later journey. But I started off literally being breastfed on Zionism. I had 4 major influences, I would say, in my life around Zionism: my home, my school environment, my synagogue, and the general environment in South Africa, which is where I grew up. I grew up in a coastal town on the east coast of South Africa called Durban. Durban has a very small Jewish community, a very intense Jewish community, and an incredibly Zionist community, aggressively Zionist community. And this is the environment in which I grew up in. If I look at my home environment, we always had, Israel was always seamlessly part of the Judaism that my family practiced. We had the Jewish National Fund Blue Box was
Teníamos diferentes parafernalias judías en nuestra casa. Cuando teníamos dinero también se nos alentaba a que donáramos dinero para ayudar a la causa. También en aquel momento no teníamos concepto de que, o no teníamos mucha claridad sobre cómo se estaban robando.
To the JNF. I went on Ulpan when I was in school, in my high school years. So Ulpan, for those who don't know, is I think it was about a 3-month period in which young people from all over South Africa go to Israel and experience life in Israel. Part of, again, this intense investment in the South African Jewish community, literally immersing us and in Israel and encouraging us to go on Aliyah. So that was my home life. My grandparents on my paternal side were ardent Zionists. My grandfather was a member of Beitar and a great supporter of Jabotinsky, who many people will know is a far right-wing Zionist who influenced many of the current Zionist, right-wing Zionist politicians that are that we're seeing on our television sets in Israel every day. And my grandfather was he had immigrated to South Africa in the early 1900s. His family had sent him out to escape the pogroms. My grandmother's family all perished in Latvia during the Holocaust. And I'm actually named after my great-grandmother, Shlovo. My Hebrew name is Shlovo. And I was named after my great-grandmother who was shot in the Rumbuli forests in Latvia. So my grandfather instilled in us this very strong Beitar ethos of fighting back. You know, that he hated the idea of meek Jews going to, in the Holocaust, like lambs to the slaughter. And he loved Israel, and he instilled in us the importance of fighting back, because the world is against the Jewish people. They want to annihilate us. And he hated this meekness that was associated with religion in his mind, that was associated with the kind of normative response of Jews to persecution and anti-Semitism. So he instilled that very strongly in me, and that was another very important influence. Then my synagogue was also a very strong influence. I was an observant Jew when I was younger. Used to go to synagogue every Friday night, every Saturday. And during the service, we always had, first of all, there were always Jewish National Fund blue boxes everywhere. There were flags of Israel in the synagogue. And we always had during the service prayers for the state of Israel and a prayer to God to protect the IDF soldiers. So all of this was seamless, Judaism with Zionism. It was absolutely unquestioned. The other thing that was a big influence for me is that I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in Durban, where I grew up. And I had neighborhood friends, which was unusual for Jewish people because most of us went to this Jewish day school. We didn't have, and it wasn't encouraged to socialize outside of the Jewish ethnic group. But I did in my street, and I got to see a lot of how other people saw Jewish people, and there was clearly anti-Semitism. So that also just entrenched in me a need for the state of Israel to protect us, because, you know, it's almost as if anti-Semitism is in our, or a perception of anti-Semitism is in my DNA. And then the biggest influence, well, one of the biggest influences was also my school. My school, also Israeli flags everywhere, Jewish studies. We learned about the Holocaust. We learned about the establishment of the state of Israel. There was always a sense that Israel was going to save us. And we also used to get shown every day of the Shoah and in between movies about the Holocaust, which were completely traumatic. We used to, you know, the images that everybody associates with the Holocaust were just absolutely seared into our brains. And after we saw these movies, there was always this sense of, thank God there's Israel. We have to make Israel, we have to strengthen Israel. We have to go on Aliyah. We have to do everything we can to make sure it was, you know, we would chant with so much passion, Am Yisrael Chai, meaning the state of Israel lives and must live. And so school was also a huge influence on me. But interestingly, what happened as a result, I think, of seeing all these, as a result of seeing these films about the Holocaust, learning about the Holocaust, and learning about anti-Semitism is that what actually became instilled in me, aside from this sort of Zionist passion, was just this deep anger around social injustice. And so when I left school and I went to university, it was really the social injustice of apartheid that consumed me. And my passion for Israel receded into the background. It was still there. I still felt very passionately that Israel was important and that it was important to the survival of the Jewish people. But I got very involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, and I left it behind as I no longer aspired to go to Israel and make Aliyah and so on. And then fast forward about 15 years from when I left school, and I had a work colleague who, during the time that I got to know her, she married a Palestinian man who was part of the Palestinian left. He's one of the founding members of PACB, and what was astounding to me, and it was such a wake-up call for me, this was really my wake-up call, is just seeing how difficult it was for them to have a normal relationship. He could never leave Gaza. It was a mission for him to leave Gaza. He was constantly harassed. So because all of this was happening to a friend of mine, I got deeply affected by it, and I could start to see parallels already with the way in which apartheid was controlling the lives of people in South Africa, and the way in which the state of Israel was controlling the lives of Palestinians. And that was a big wake-up call. And I did manage to come to South Africa at various stages in their marriage, and I got to meet him, speak with him, and for the first time, sorry, I've got something stuck in my throat. For the first time, I started to see that there actually was a left movement in Palestine that I could relate to. And the language of this movement resonated with the mass democratic movement that had been built in South Africa. A discourse on human rights, a discourse around non-violence, although an acceptance that violence under certain circumstances is justified. There are such things as just wars. But the whole language of PACB, the language of BDS, I started to get to understand that there was another world in Palestine that I could really relate to. Before that, it always felt like Palestine was a big mess. There were fundamentalists fighting the Jews, wanting to push us into the sea. There was nothing there that I could say, this is something that resonates. This struggle is something that I resonate with, that I have something in common with. And so the more I learned about what the BDS movement was trying to achieve, the more I started to see a place for myself in solidarity. At the same time, I was reading a lot. So through my friend's husband, I was put in contact with reading lists, and I read a number of books that hugely influenced me. I was also, like Wendy, influenced by Ilan Pappé and his book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But very importantly, there are a group of what are called new historians who have documented history based on new information that came to rise when state security files were, after a certain amount of time, they had to be made open to the public. And so the new historians stepped into that breach. And a book that just blew my mind was a book by Avi Shleim called The Iron Wall. And what influenced me mostly about the Iron Wall was just the way, so from the opening of these files were minutes of meetings from the founding fathers and mothers of Israel. And just for me, it was so shocking to see how leaders like Moshe Dayan, for example, who in minutes of meetings said very frankly, we pushed the war with Syria. We actually, we had provocations that we had carefully planned and that ultimately led to the 67 war. It was things like that that completely just, I was shocked and horrified. I began to feel like I had been lied to, that a lot of the sort of myths that were built up that, you know, we were surrounded by Arab nations that wanted to annihilate us, and therefore we had no choice but to defend ourselves in these wars. And to read this information from the new historians for me was just a complete eye-opener. And so for me, that was really my journey. And I moved very tentatively. You know, I have to say, initially, I was, I couldn't even bring myself to say words like ethnic cleansing or settler colonialism. I just felt like this can't be the Jewish people. We can't possibly be involved in something like ethnic cleansing. But the realities of what actually took place, of the Nakba, of the ongoing Nakba, the parallels between apartheid Israel and apartheid South Africa just became so stark and so obvious that, you know, now I can't think any other way except to see us as settler colonialists and ethnic cleansers. So that was really my journey, and I think I'm going to end there. You can see it was very different from Wendy's, but we had similar influences later in our journeys.
Yes, thank you so much, Shireen, for that. I'm very pleased. In a minute, I will introduce Lori. I'm so glad that she was able to get on. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, but we made it, yay. And I just want to underscore in Shireen's journey, yes, that big difference, and how you were absolutely drenched in Zionism and seeing it seamless with Judaism, part of your synagogue experience, the tzedakah, the little blue boxes from the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, that collected money, and the myths that were held up as truths, especially the JNF still maintains that they're turning the desert, they turned the desert green, now they're going to keep it green. Well, we know that those trees actually were covering up villages that were destroyed, and also planting pine trees that made grazing impossible for people who had flocks. And but I think what is so powerful is that reaching Zionism, seeing what it actually was, understanding the Nakba, and seeing the similarities with anti-apartheid, with the apartheid, and being an anti-apartheid activist, and then seeing the parallel is so important. Many times we find progressive people in the States, for instance, or progressive people all over the world, who seem to be progressive about everything except Palestine. And can't make the leap. So this is like an invitation. Maybe you need a little more information, like be open to that information so that you can actually see that there is this actual real parallel. So thank you so much, Shireen. Lori, you're right on time for the first question, which is to share a bit about your background, your family's relationship to Israel, Judaism, and Zionism, and then what was your process about coming to question Zionism?
What an honor to be here. Can you hear me okay? Good. So I wish I had heard other people, but I'll get to hear it maybe in the recording. I don't know if it's similar storyline. So the dinner table in my house was about Black liberation struggle and Zionism. So there was this this parallel of like Zionism was a radicalizing movement along with Black liberation struggle. This is in the 70s in Washington Heights in New York City. So I believed all that. And I grew up with, I think, a very similar, well, I don't know what I heard that at the end. We have to plant trees in Israel. Jews need a safe harbor. No matter what happens, even if you can get away with your white skin privilege in the United States, there was a lot of awareness around that in my family growing up, that you still were always a Jew, and you were going to be reminded you were a Jew, and you could end up in the ovens. And we were barraged. I went to, I grew up in the Conservadox movement and went to this camp called Camp Ramah. And on Tisha B'Av, one of the days of mourning, we were like bombarded with images of the Holocaust and pogroms and the Spanish Inquisition. And it was a real interesting thing to expose, 5 and 6 and 7-year-old people, little people to instill a real embodied fear around what it means to be Jewish, and to have to always see the world as out to get you, out to hurt you, and to be afraid. And then to have to fight harder and be stronger and be better, and all that stuff that happens with intergenerational trauma. Yes, to the planting of trees. And I had no knowledge of what you just talked about with the pine trees, and no awareness of that. And it was maybe about 12 years ago, not that long ago, I had a student, I don't know, who might be on this call maybe, at Goddard College, who's Jewish, and started to tell me a lot more about what was going on, really what's going on about the occupation, and I learned about it also. And she said a question to me that really woke me up. She said, "Where did you learn that to feel safe in your body as a Jew in New York, that there has to be this state of Israel at any cost?" And for whatever reason, I was opening to really receiving that question. And as a person who is very kinesthetic in how I make meaning through the world, my first response was, oh my goodness, like, yes, that's so true. Like, my body had this myth that I really believed, like not just in my mind, but every cell, every organ, every vessel, every bone, like my body really believed that story. That was a story I believed. And from that day on, I started to educate myself and read and talked to people. And recently, I don't know if this is part of this question or not, so you can tell me, Melissa, if I'm stepping over it. I was on a clergy trip with 22 other rabbis to Palestine, Israel, where we spoke with many different organizations and Palestinian farmers and human rights activists. And I still heard rabbis call themselves progressive Zionists. And I was the only one that said, no, like, that's not okay. And people were upset with me. And these are the progressive people. A couple of people came up to me afterward and spoke to me in quiet and said, well, I kind of sort of agree with you, but no one like publicly said, yes, this is like, let's wrestle with this. So this, I don't know, the parallel, it's a parallel and it's not, but we have to like do the schema that we know of, like, who are the good white people in the United States, but like, you have to be an anti-racist, you have to be an anti-sexist, you have to be an anti-Zionist to like make change. And I was challenged by the progressive people saying, well, sexism and racism were never really liberation movements, but Zionism was. And I was like, no, that's a myth too. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lori. You did kind of go into the next question, which is just fine because it's all related. And I didn't actually say to everyone that Ayela Wynters is on the faculty and is the Jewish Chaplain Rabbi at SUNY, the state university in New York in New Paltz, and faculty at the City University in New York and at Goddard College. And her work and practice lives at the intersection of art making as a vehicle for social change, liberatory psychologies and theologies, and the sacred informed by our bodies, deep knowing, and capacities for individual and collective social healing. So I'm sorry to not have given that wonderful introduction, but you all heard how Lori just went on this delegation, which I think she'll probably tell us a little bit more about coming up, and how those myths were really, that were learned early on, lived in her body. So that was a really important piece. It's something that we all need to look at, do that hard work of what about Zionism is still lodged in our body and what's the work that we need to do about that. So the next question, before I go on, there was a question about what is PCA B, and that's the Palestine
Think it's the academic
campaign for the academic the Palestine campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, and it's part of the BDS movement.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next question, which is, as an anti-Zionist Jew, what inspires you? How do you live into your vision of Judaism once Palestine is free? And this is when you can also share if you have something that you want to share. And Shireen, would you start this time?
Yes, sure. I think Hani's going to put some slides up because you asked us to put some slides, but in fact, I can just speak to it in general. I think that, so it's quite difficult for me because I don't know how to, okay, so I was going to start off just saying that the things that inspire me and continue to inspire me are some of the readings that I'm doing or that I have done that have led me to, that have inspired me and have motivated me. So they continue to motivate me as I read new things. You can see there's Avi Shlem's book, the Iron Wall, Ilan Pape's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. I was very influenced by Edward Said, and more recently have read the book, The General's Son, which has really resonated in many ways with me as a South African, because Mikko Peled speaks about how he first started to make connections with Palestinians and how, you know, everybody was so terrified that he was going to cross a line now and go into the occupied territories and his life was going to be at risk. And in fact, when he made those connections, all he found was hospitality and love and welcoming. And that also resonates a lot being South African. I was very inspired by that because in South Africa, there was always this thing, if you went into the black townships, you were going to be killed as a white person, you know, and this was when I was much younger. And most often and more often than not, you would just be welcomed with open arms, and people would be, Black South Africans in the main would be welcoming of white South Africans who were trying to cross boundaries. So I find these books are very inspiring. And then the next slide is the logo of the South African Jews for Free Palestine. I'm very inspired by my comrades in the movement. We are a small group of South African Jews, We punch above our weight, I think. I like to think. But I'm very inspired by my comrades. They are all good people who have gone through some similar journeys to me. Others have had their own journey to anti-Zionism. But it's a very nurturing and supportive group of people that continue to inspire me. And then I'm very inspired by the BDS movement, which is the next slide. For many years, I was part of BDS South Africa, and the South African Jews for Free Palestine. I was on the board of the BDS movement, and now the South African Jews for Free Palestine is affiliated to the BDS movement globally. So that continues to inspire me, particularly, as I was saying earlier, the resonance between the South African experience of our mass democratic movement and the language of BDS around human rights, the discourse of human rights, the discourse of nonviolence, the discourse of international law, has really resonated with me. So these are things that continue to inspire me. How I live my life as a Jewish person is much more of an existential question, because I'm a secular Jew. I've moved away from being, from my childhood observance. I have a young child, an 18-year-old child, and I've struggled a lot with knowing what part of the culture and what part of the religion to communicate. So let us say I'm in my own existential crisis around Judaism and my own identity, but I still feel strongly Jewish. But how that relates to my Judaism is an existential question that I grapple with. What I can say is that I'm completely able to separate any form of Judaism from Zionism.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you so much. I hope people took note of the books, and when if you didn't, you'll see the recording, which you will receive later, and then you can take note. Those are really helpful. I know many people have made big changes in their lives upon reading any one of those books. And I think the language of BDS is also really important to note as inspiration. Thank you so much for that. And Wendy, would you like to answer that last question?
Yeah, absolutely. Shireen, I just wanted to say in our point of convergence that that obviously in book was also, that was the first book we read in our history of Zionism group that feels very dear to my heart, because it was part of my awakening. So it was sweet to feel that resonance between us. Yeah, I feel like Shireen, I'm so inspired by the BDS movement, by here in the States, by Jewish Voice for Peace. It's very dear to my heart. We're one of the first chapters of that organization. I'm inspired by Palestinian resistance and steadfastness in the face of oppression. I'm inspired by all the Jews and other folks showing up for Palestine solidarity. We have a whole listserv in Seattle of all these organizations now. We're doing so much coalitional work, and there's just so many connections being made between oppression in the Philippines and in Palestine and racism in the United States. And I feel inspired by those intersections, the ways that we can work together. The Palestinian Feminist Collective is a burgeoning organization that is amazing. And I'm inspired by all the culture building beyond Zionism. It's also interesting, Shireen, just how our stories start out so different and then we converge. And then as an adult, I've found my spiritual home in Judaism. So it's an interesting thing that I'm so inspired by all the work that's being done to envision a way to be religiously or spiritually Jewish that is about justice and freedom, and it can be anti-Zionist. And then Lori, I was thinking about what you were saying about how it lives in your body. And yeah, that's kind of the work I'm doing in my healing groups. We're running these groups, and it's about kind of getting to feel what's in our bodies and how do we heal that. So I'm running these groups, and it's really inspiring how many people are interested in these anti-Zionist healing groups. They're really hungry for connection, and we get to build really beautiful space together. I really love work that helps Jews break out of these historical trauma responses that we've been talking about. I think this came up in both what Lori was saying and what Shireen was saying, but this idea that Zionism, it promotes a myth that like we were once these powerless victims of the diaspora, and now we have to defend our power. It's constantly under threat. We can only have a fight response so that we don't have another Nazi Holocaust. And there's a way that lives in our bodies. It constantly makes us feel unsafe. So Zionism is really thriving on eliciting this fear and defensiveness in our bodies all around the globe, Jews all around the globe, to justify this need. And I think there's so much healing that we can do to help us understand what Zionism was a response to, both that it was a response partially to Jewish trauma, but that it was also, a colonial response that modeled itself after European colonialism. And it became a deeply traumatizing force, first and foremost for Palestinians, but it's also traumatizing for Jews to constantly feel unsafe and to constantly feel like our safety depends on having a state that separates us from other people, that we can't be safe and connected to non-Jews. That's that's the message. And it's so bad for us. It's so bad for us. And I can still feel the ways that lives inside me and all the ways I need healing around that. So I think I'm really inspired by work that is spiritual and healing, that can take account of all of us. And, that we don't just do our politics from a place of not feeling, a numbness, that we do our political activism from a deep place of feeling. And for me, when I am rooted inside of spirit and when I am rooted inside of my Jewish identity, then that is the strongest place for me to do my activism from. And I'm most inspired by the culture building work that is both political and that we do ritual together that really can move people and move hearts and bodies to join us in the struggle, because we've made our movements so compelling and so embodied in what we're doing. I did forget to show my slides, but I'm going to do it right now.
Okay.
So the other thing while I'm doing that is that, okay, I should have shared them. All right, hold on. This is the
timing, don't worry.
All right. So I am an artist and I do lino cuts and I do a bunch of anti-Zionist Jewish art. And so I wanted to share, okay, here it goes, I'm sharing. I wanted to share, it's gonna take just one more second. Just a couple pieces of art. So these slides, this first one is a collaboration between myself and this company in Portland called the Portland Stamp Company. And these were little lino cuts that they made into these lick and peel stamps. And all proceeds from buying these goes to Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization I love and care about the most. And so I've gotten a lot of sweet feedback. I think people like to see, sometimes we can feel really marginalized as anti-Zionists. And so I think people love to see culture that is upholding our values. And so these are these little tiny stamps, and they're a way you can just stick them on like your letters when you send them out, and then everyone can see them. So that was a really fun project for me to get to, to get to create art that other people could see and be inspired by and feel just like witnessed and reflected in. And then these are two lino cuts that honor two of our queer anti-Zionist Jewish ancestors. So Leslie Feinberg, who passed recently from Lyme disease, and they were a really, they were just a freedom fighter for so many different things, gender justice and for Palestine. And Melanie K. Kantrowitz, if you haven't read her book, The Colors of Jews, it's one of my all-time favorites, so inspiring. And she offers a beautiful framework for us around diasporism as an alternative to Zionism and the ways that we get to embrace what it means to be Jews in the diaspora. And then that's something we should be proud of, and that's where we should be putting our energy, is building home where we are. So this is just a little, I just wanted to show a couple of the pieces of kinds of art I do as a lino cut artist. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I am such a big fan of your artwork. And also I want to give you a shout out because I was inspired by that question you once posed of how do we envision Judaism once Palestine is free? Because we are going to see Palestine free. I hope it is in my lifetime and soon. And I want to be able to envision how we are going to be. So I thank you for that question, and I want to give you that shout out. Lori, please take it away about your inspirations and how you see Judaism once Palestine is free.
Yeah, I love those images. They're. I'm thinking it's so funny. So I have this book right next to me. The Issue is Power, Melanie K. Kantrowitz, who was a mentor of mine in my work around anti-oppression work in the United States. And she was one of the few Jewish mentors I had. And I remember her talking about what does it mean to live diasporically. And I remember feeling like, well, we've always lived diasporically, like that's how we have lived. And there's something about wanting to keep nourishing that and feeding that. And what does that mean? And keep being in that conversation. So that's certainly part of my vision that I feel like exists now. And how do we keep that alive? Because to be Jewish, it means so many different things to so many of us, and to keep that conversation alive. And I think that's where I want to put energy into. I guess I'm thinking a few things. Like I was very inspired by the groups and organizations when I was in Palestine, Israel, Tagir, Roots in Judor, the Parents Circle, A Land for All, Standing Together, that there's some way for Palestinians to live with integrity and dignity in their own land, and for Jews to find a way to live diasporically and also have relationship with their land as well. In some way that is generative for everybody. And may that happen in our lifetime also. And I guess my real, my most alive vision comes with young people. I have a 19-year-old daughter, and I feel like everyone who's in their 50s or over, or any age, I guess, should have mentors who are at least 25, 30 years younger than them. Because I see her and her people, they don't hold the same trauma shit. Can I say that in this group? They don't hold that same embodied trauma and historical trauma in the same way. And there's so much work to be done, it feels like, to keep letting go of that for Jews in particular. And that's part of the work that I do in the world, to naming it, seeing it, and composting it. I don't know that we ever can release old habit patterns of fight, flight, fear response, because we have this, I say I'm a recovering psychologist, so I have a lot of background in neuroscience in the brain and the primitive brain, but we can create new habit patterns to co-regulate our nervous systems in community, in ritual, in the ways we experience our Judaism together. For me, ritual is really important. Prayer together is really important. That takes lots of different forms, not necessarily in the I don't even know, traditional, like whose tradition, the conventional, whose convention, but in liberatory forms. What's liberatory prayer practice for each of us? And I think my experience, part of being Jewish, is that we're inventing that all the time. And I'm going to go a little bit to Torah, where one, there's many names for the divine, is the translation in Hebrew is, I will become who I will continue becoming, if we are made in the image of divinity. So that we're not a fixed being, that we're always in process of becoming who we are, calling forth the more generative, beautiful, sustainable world that our hearts know is possible, and that we can't do it alone. We need to do it in community with each other. Like, that's not an option. And I'm thinking of Aurora Levins-Morales' poem about the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, that we all have to cross together, or no one gets across. And so this thing about, when I see youth culture, this I experience what I experience. I know it's not true for all youth culture. There's this real capacity to work for collective liberation in their bodies in a way that feels very hopeful. And I see it more and more. And I think what was so disturbing for me when I was in Palestine, Israel recently, is that I was told that the youth culture, about many of them, I don't know the percentage, are right wing, because they don't learn anything in their educational system. It's like in the United States, not having learned about the residential schools for the indigenous native population, they don't learn anything. So my vision is that there is true, real education of story, and people really hear the truth, like that there's witnessing and seeing, so people can really name and feel in their bodies the truth, and allow connection and empathy and compassion and sorrow and grief, and the real what intimacy really means involves truth telling and connecting from that place, and so that's my vision. So and I feel like that's that the hope for that is in youth culture, and it's also our job to keep doing our own releasing energetically in our bodies and physically, so we're not in that fear response, so we can really support that kind of connection.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you very much for that, that vision. Before our next question, I'm just going to remind people that you can go to the icon on the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, and you can drop in a question that you would like to ask either all of the panelists or one in particular. We have one last question for them, which they have all in some way started to answer. But I'm going to say it again or make it clear. which is, what is your call to action to Jews at this moment? What do you want to say or recommend or invite? And I was giving everybody a turn to go first. So Lori, if you feel like taking this one, or if you'd like to wait a second because you just spoke and sometimes it needs a moment. She'll wait. Okay, thank you, Lori. Wendy, would you like to take this one? What is your call to action?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of our calls to action is for those of us who are anti-Zionists, that we call in our people and that we do that with warmth and compassion, and that we kind of meet people where they are at, with kind of understanding what we've been talking about, that like, yeah, there's a lot of Jews who hold these beliefs that we really disagree with, and that they come from, right, forces that are larger than just individuals, right? That Zionism has been ingrained in for many folks since, they were born into it and inherit it from their families, from the culture. And so that we kind of approach those conversations with compassion and warmth and understanding of the fear that Zionism thrives off of, and that we have to offer alternatives and show a path to liberation that is not based on fear, that is not based on racial othering or closing our boundaries or feeling like we can't be connected. And, I think, like I was saying, we need to make our movements irresistible, because we offer a really different vision that includes beautiful culture and music and art and warmth and connection and rituals. And that's what we want to invite people into. So I think, the call for Jews is that we refuse to be complicit in apartheid, that we support the call for BDS, that we support and fund Palestinian-led organizing and resistance, Jewish-led organizing and resistance, the joint organizations wherever we are, like Jewish Voice for Peace in the US, and to always be accountable to Palestinians who are being targeted by Israel's discriminatory and violent policies, and that we work to effectively build our accountable counter as Jews, so that we really can end Israeli apartheid in our lifetimes and stop the ongoing Nakba and offer reparations. And in the US, we're the biggest funder of Israeli apartheid. And so we really need to work to change US policy, to shift US culture, to end military support for the state of Israel. So I think those are all part of our calls to action. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That was very, there's something for everyone in there. Shireen, would you like to share your call to action?
Yes, thanks, Melissa. I think my call to action must be that we've got to step up and we've got to speak out, and we've got to be authentic, genuine allies to the struggle, allies to Palestinians in the struggle. I think that we need to see it as our struggle too. We have been, as Jewish people, co-opted into Israel and into the vision of Israel. It's supposedly there to protect all of us, even if we're in the diaspora. It's our safe haven. It speaks and it claims to speak in all of our names. So I think that because of that, and because of the fact that there's so much conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, that it's imperative that Jewish people speak out and say there are Jewish people who are proud to be Jewish, who are saying we are unequivocally anti-Zionist, and it cannot be that we are anti-Semitic, although we are always, I know in South Africa we often described as self-hating Jews. But nevertheless, I think that we've got to grit our teeth and get out there with compassion, as Wendy says, but also with grit, to get out there and be a very clear voice that says you can be Jewish and be anti-Zionist, that this is not happening in our name. And I think what's also really important, and it was something that was very important in the struggle for liberation in South Africa, is that being allies to the struggle and being in joint solidarity with Palestinians in the struggle is very important also for the vision of what comes afterwards. So in South Africa, that was really important to have a constitution that entrenched a non-racial, non-sexist democratic South Africa. And to have that, I mean, that is a human right. I'm not saying it's a privilege, but I'm saying that we can't just sit back and hope that this is going to happen. We need to play our role in making sure that, in my opinion, I know I'm not sure how many people share this, but in my opinion, we need to be guided by the Palestinians in what the solution to the conflict is. But in my mind, I feel we need to, the only possible solution that is just is for a one-state solution where we live in a democratic society that is not based on ethnicity in any shape or form. And I think that Jewish people need to, as I say, step up and speak out so that the dream of a one-state solution can actually be something that is seen to be viable, doable, desirable, and something that people buy into and believe is possible. I think that's part of the role we need to play.
Thank you, Shireen. So I'm just going to give everybody a heads up that it's now 11:12. There's some really interesting comments coming into us and also some questions. So Lori, please share your vision, your call to action, which you actually have done a bit of, but please, here's your opportunity again. And then I'll be able to share some of the comments and maybe one or two questions. And there's, so go ahead, Lori, please.
Yes, my call to action is to lift the veil off of what's going on in Palestine for Jewish people in the United States. So just short story moment. I'm a chaplain rabbi at a state university. I sent out an email naming what I did and named the organizations and said I'll be doing a talk and I'm composing a video of the conversation. And I don't know, maybe about 20 people said, great, we're interested. And 3 people sent me separate emails, all Jewish colleagues, really, really upset with me that how could I, as the Jewish chaplain, even bring something like this to the campus? These are people in education, they're in psychology, they're so locked into the fear, and their way was to attack me. So these are the people that I need to reach in some way. So my call to action is to continue having these spaces and conversations. I think, Wendy, earlier you said to meet people where they are at. Easier said than done, right? And yet, how do we still hold space for people to have an opening into another way of being and seeing, and not having to hold so tightly onto that mythical identity that has been fed to us. And I think someone said in the chat that it's been intentionally fed. It's not even necessarily some of it might be unconscious, but I think some of it's also really intentionally we're marinating in it. So how do we keep holding space. And I'm particularly interested for people to talk about what is their relationship to being Jewish, because I don't know that people have that reflective capacity. They join the team really quickly without having a reflection, and to keep showing and telling the stories that the Palestinians have shared and told when I was there that I didn't know about either, to keep exposing it, for people to keep seeing and witnessing. Because if you really are looking, you can't go back to the way it was if you're really listening to who you are. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lori. Yes, once you see, you cannot unsee. Yeah, it's really true. And on that note, somebody, Reem, who is in the audience, asked us to remind people to watch the newly released Palestinian film Farha, that is under attack by Zionists, because it tells a Palestinian narrative. So please watch it. It's on Netflix. It's not a Netflix commercial, but let's watch this film. And if you have ways of being positive about it, it is, and somebody just wrote that it's not possible, it's being boycotted. So we need to tell Netflix we want to watch it. Okay, so that comment about how Jewish trauma is being intentionally passed down. I remember my own experience in first grade of watching the film that the Nazis had made and seeing all the horrible, horrible images from the concentration camps. But I was only 5 years old, and that certainly went in very deep. So we have to find a way to talk about that truth without re-traumatizing and keeping the trauma going. So the name of the film, and maybe I'm saying it wrong, is Farha, F-A-R-H-A. Thank you for asking. And there was a question early on from Germany, from Jutta, which is, as a German, coming from the country of the Holocaust, the Shoah, with growing anti-Semitism in the present time, being an anti-Zionist. For me, it is so important and not always easy to make a clear difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because in my country, there are anti-Semitic patterns used by critics towards the Israeli government and the existence of Israel. Patterns like conspiracy, Jewish superpower in international networks, and many others. Which patterns do you recognize, is her question. And let's just have one person maybe answer it, and then we could take another question. Who would like to?
Maybe I can just say, I think this is another reason why it's so important for Jewish anti-Zionists to speak out, because that is important in making a clear distinction between right-wing anti-Zionism and anti-Zionism that is based on human rights for all and for a just peace in Palestine. I think the more Jewish people who speak out and identify as anti-Zionist, the more and adopt that discourse, the more clear the distinction will be between right-wing anti-Zionists and anti-Zionists who are coming from a place of and a discourse of human rights. I think it is problematic. I mean, we are seeing, I think, that it's not just in Germany. I think it's a global phenomenon of rising anti-Semitism in certain parts of the world that does then also equate with anti-Zionism. But equally, there's a very large right-wing fundamentalist movement that is very pro-Zionist. And that those distinctions, I think, can only be made when Jewish people who are anti-Zionist speak out and identify their struggle, articulate it in a way that clarifies the differences between being right-wing anti-Zionist and being an anti-Zionist based on human rights discourse.
Thank you, Shireen. I'll just add a comment here that Leora Madison sent in, and just the last line about our goal should be to process the trauma in healthy ways that don't harm others, the way Zionism does, or exposing our children too young, and don't let Zionism proclaim itself as the only legitimate response to that trauma, not to never feel our trauma, as to say, the trauma is real, we have it. And many of us have family that we know that they experience this. The Holocaust is real. Nobody is denying the trauma. So we do want to work with it in a conscious way. And I really appreciate that about don't allow Zionism to be the only domain where it is legitimate response. I do want to remind people about the IHRA, IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Their definition of anti-Semitism is any criticism of Israel and any Israeli or Jewish institution. So we want to be really conscious about this and also fight against this definition, which is especially in the academic world. They're really trying to make it impossible to teach about this in schools. And it seems like in Europe, it's won a lot of grounds, but there are some people and groups struggling against it. So I'm going to go back to the questions, and we have maybe a minute for. There's a lot of wonderful questions in here. Can be hard to sift through them, but I will read. Steve Nash said, in the global playback theater community, this festival of solidarity is seen by Israelis and others as being against the core principle of playback, that we should all simply be able to tell and listen to each other's stories and truths. Sadness and anger about this event was expressed several times to me by Israelis at the recent European gathering in Sofia. It's been so important for me to hear from the four of you today as a non-Jewish playbacker who is trying to be an ally to Palestine. How do I start to engage with my Israeli playback friends in a meaningful way about all of this? Sorry to be a long question. If anybody would like to take this on, maybe Lori as a playbacker.
Yeah, well, they're mad at me too, so you're not alone. Well, I think two things. I think it's tied to the question also about the difference between being anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, which is that's an ongoing conversation, and I sort of. I want to honor that question. I just want to go back to the question that was asked by the person who lives in Germany. One of the ways, and people know this, and I don't know that I'm saying anything you don't already know, is to like when there's a critique made, is it part of an anti-Jewish trope that goes way before the Holocaust, pogroms, the Spanish Inquisition? I mean, we need to go back historically to what are these tropes. So that's one way to like start to recognize. Chua has I think a good piece written on like looking at the languaging, the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And the piece about playback, the piece that's missing sometimes in playback, may I say this, is locating ourselves in the larger social, ecological, cultural, political context. That stories are personal stories, but they're also within this larger context. So we need to talk about that as well. So as a playback practitioner, it's really useful to bring Augusto Boal's work, Theater of the Oppressed work, in with our playback theater work, because there's personal story and there's personal story located in these larger contexts. So to respond to the question, it makes people uncomfortable to talk about the larger context sometimes. And we just have to honor that and keep living with that knowing and discomfort, and also holding that in great reverence and respect. And it's not an easy task. I don't think this is not going against the principles of playback theater. Playback theater is a form of emancipatory, liberatory theater, and improvising real life from a place of all of our multiple perspectives and truths and narratives. This is very much in the spirit of playback.
Oh, thank you. I would just add also that I invite Israelis who are concerned about this, who want to talk about the subject, to get together with themselves. This is what we did when in the feminist movement, we invited the men to get together and they started doing work that was really important. Black liberation movement invites white people to work on their own racism, to examine themselves, their role in racism. And I invite Israelis to get together with themselves and look at these questions. And not to take it as being against them. We are so happy that there are anti-Zionist Israelis and that there are people questioning, and we acknowledge them. We centered the comfort of Palestinians in this festival. We felt that that was something that we wanted to respect, was asked for, and we respect, and held that as a strong value. So I wish we had the time to take all the questions, and I think we have begun an amazing conversation here. I am incredibly grateful to the thoughtfulness, the wisdom, and the whole life experiences that people have brought here. And if you have a 1-minute closing, I invite each of you to share your 1-minute closing, and then we will wrap. Wendy, would you like to give your closing?
I just think when we're talking about anti-Semitism, it's important to remember that the Israeli government is deeply anti-Semitic, and that they make alliances with Christian Zionists who believe that when Jesus' second coming, all the Jews in Israel will burn. And so they have no problem allying with right-wing governments like Viktor Orban, because they do not, they care about land and power, and I think they don't actually care about Jews. They started out of anti-Semitism and they continue to do things that are anti-Semitic. And I think that needs to be an important part of the conversation, that we remember that we can 100% be anti-Zionist and we can be fighting against anti-Semitism. So I just wanted to name that in this conversation. I've been so honored to be a part of it, and I look forward to continuing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Shireen, would you like to give your parting words?
I don't have parting words except to say thank you to Playback Theatre for convening this webinar. I think these meetings of minds and spirits is very important because it feeds us, and we need feeding because we've got a big struggle, and the struggle is hard, and it's hard to be attacked as a self-hating Jew when you know that actually you're standing up for something that is just and good and important. And I think that these kind of gatherings help us to have strength to go forward in that struggle. So thank you very much for convening.
Thank you. Lori? Lori, you're muted. Can't unmute. Not able to unmute. Oh dear.
Unmuted,
go.
am I? Oh, okay.
Now you're fine.
Okay. Yeah. I don't have necessarily closing words, but really grateful to be part of this conversation, and we need these conversations to keep enlarging the territory of what Jewish means. Really enlarging that and transforming that to include this true liberation, and to keep holding each other's hands and keep taking each other out of the narrow places. That's why we're here, in celebration and joy too.
Thank you all.